I'm not going to say very much about the book. I'm going to leave that to Kari, but I can't resist just saying a few words. Many of you have now seen the book and hopefully will purchase a copy, which Kari will sign for you. But it really is a remarkable collection. In the first half of the book, Kari brings the work of her late father, Kari Polanyi, into dialogue with Marx, von Mises, Hayek, Keynes. She revisits the critical debates he inspired in the social sciences, in economic history, economic anthropology, and more recently in all the social science disciplines, and discusses the relevance of his work to contemporary society. In one essay, she asks how Polanyi would respond to proposals for a basic income as a citizen right. Her essay on his writings in Vienna during the interwar period resonate with the search today for a democratic model of economic development. The essays in the second part of the book contain important articles on international political economy, economic development, analysis of the 2008 crisis, and on the role of the rising economies of the global south, especially India and China. In her essays on development, Kari traces the history of North-South relations of domination to the era of mercantilism. In these essays, she pays tribute to important writers from the South, including Raoul Prebisch, Arthur Lewis, Dudley Sears, and Osvaldo Sunkel, and to the schools of thought and the institutions they inspired. I hope this has tempted you to not leave here this evening without purchasing a copy of the book. I want to just end by giving very special thanks to Professor Dorval Mendell, who's the director of the Institut d'études internationales de Montréal, for co-sponsoring this evening, and of course to Anna Gomez, who's here somewhere, for all her help and constant presence and generosity in everything that we do. So I will give the floor to, or would you like to stay seated here? Would you like to come up here?
No, I'm quite happy to stay right here. Is it working? The microphone. But first of all, I want to thank everybody who was involved in arranging this book launch, and most especially all of you who have come here. And I'm quite sure that you're all going to buy at least one book. Now, the story of this book, there's a very short story and there's a longer story. Let me start with the short one. A few years ago, I was approached by the archivist of the McGill Library to ask whether I would permit all my writings and my life and all my work to be archived in the McGill Library. I almost fell over with surprise, and of course I was very pleased and very honored at this proposal, which in fact is underway, and a lot of it has actually been done. Well, in the process of looking through a lot of my work, I realized that I have a lot of things that have on issues of development that have not been published, and maybe I should think about finding an editor where I could place some of these things in a collection of essays. And I spoke with my friend Errol Sharp, right? I have to get the right Errol, I know several Errol. And he said, yes, but have you written anything about your father? And I said, yes. Well, obviously, he was very interested, particularly interested in my writings about my father, because, as you all know, there is a lot and a growing interest in the work and the writings of Kari Polanyi, and particularly since 2008, but actually starting in the late 90s, a noticeable interest in connection with the, what I would call the financialization and the crisis, evolving crisis of capitalism. So we agreed that we would publish something. It would be in two parts. The first part pertaining to the work of my father, thank you, and the second part to my own work. And I'm very happy. I think, well, I hope that these two parts can somehow make one whole. That is for you to decide. A good friend of mine, Professor Norman Gerben from the University of the West Indies, has written a very friendly review in which he said, well, the Kari Polanyi Levitt of today is a lot more Polanyi than she was in the 1960s. And I thought about that. It is probably true. But I have to say, in defense of my integrity, that this is so for a lot of other people too. That the work of my father has come to the attention of many scholars, thinkers, intellectuals, and writers over the year who initially either did not know of his work or were not particularly influenced by it. And in that sense, I would suggest that I am really, although I am the daughter, I am no different from many others who have come to appreciate the work of Kari Polanyi particularly in the past 10 or 15 years. And that, I think, has assisted in making perhaps more of a unity between the two parts of the book. Now let me explain how I got into this Polanyi business. Speaking now about the Institute and the work of my father. It started in 1978 with the death of my mother. My mother was the keeper of all writings, of all documents, of all small pieces of paper. If there is today a Kari Polanyi archive right here upstairs, it is because my mother is responsible for having kept the entire record of my father's work. My father would have not known how to do that, or would not have been interested. That was not what he was about. But my mother, who had her own interests, which were quite different, was the person who she was the keeper of the legacy. And when my mother died, that function passed to me by the will of my father and the will of my mother. And I then, so to speak, inherited the responsibility for the literary legacy of my father, and I have taken that responsibility very seriously. But let me tell you how it evolved. When my mother died, my mother has been described as a sovereign revolutionary. My mother was an iconic figure of the days of the anti-war movement in the First World War in Budapest. She was the organizer of a small group of young people who distributed anti-war literature in the barracks and in the great munition factories in Budapest. They were caught and they were put on trial for treason, and she was actually in prison, released by the declaration of the Hungarian Republic in 1918. So my mother is a legendary figure in that sense, but she had been extremely critical of the current regime at that time, in the 1970s, and delighted in embarrassing important people by her presence and by what she had to say. But after she died, the Hungarian embassy in Ottawa lost no time in communicating with me that they wished the body. They wished her to be buried ceremoniously in Budapest. Well, I was a little shocked at the suddenness of this, and I said, well, just a moment. My father's remains are resting in a cemetery in a small village near Pickering, Toronto, where he died in 1964, and my parents were rested together in Budapest. But not before the work of my father has also been acknowledged, before we have made some appropriate event in the nature of a conference honoring the work of Kari Polanyi. And at that time, the work of Kari Polanyi was in a kind of a shady area in terms of its acceptability to the communist authorities of the day. The anthropological work was considered sufficiently distant in the past not to be critical, but the Great Transformation had not been translated to Hungarian and was not translated until after 1989. So in any event, there was a negotiation, and there was a centenary conference, and some of you have heard already quite a lot about it. And after that, there was the foundation of the Institute here. And that, in a sense, was my entry into the writings of my father, because unlike many others here, including Margie, I am not a Polanyi scholar. My areas of work have been quite otherwise, issues of developing countries, and international political economy, and the teachers from whom I learned very much did not include Kari Polanyi. So I came to the careful reading of the work of my father rather late in life, and in the capacity of the responsibility for the literary legacy. The conference, the centenary conference, was held in Budapest. Margie referred to a conference which was held just exactly 9 years ago in Budapest, in that same impressive main hall of the University of the Academy of Sciences. And I remember it very well because, for two reasons. One is that it was the first occasion on which I had to make a major public address without being able to see one written word. In other words, I had to memorize it or present it without aid of notes, and it was very difficult. And the other is that I was wearing the same green jacket that you see here. And it's one reason that I decided to wear it this afternoon. So, at the Centennial Conference, which was in Budapest, and how it was arranged that the Hungarians invited Hungarians, and we, principally myself, invited the international contingent, which was composed of any individual who had written about Polanyi or who had translated his work. Most of these people were unknown to me. Since then they became colleagues and friends. And I remember when Walter Neal, who was one of my father's Columbia students, and he came to Budapest, and we were very happy to see him. And he accosted me a little, I thought a little aggressively, and said to me, remember I had made these arrangements for my parents to rest in the cemetery in Budapest. He said, Kari, are you trying to tell us that Karl was a Hungarian? He was really quite shocked, because they knew Kari Polanyi as a professor at Columbia in the 1940s, and the idea that in some way this person had important origins in some distant Central European country called Hungary, I think never entered into their consciousness. And I say that because I do believe that the, let me call it, Central European origin of my father was extremely important in understanding his work and in understanding particularly those pieces in the book, those first, I would say, first four, first four essays that are in the book. And I say that because in continental Europe, but I would perhaps particularly in Central Europe, the First World War was probably the most important single event of the 20th century. It was a totally devastating event. And it, apart from, of course, the mindless killing, it was perhaps nowhere felt quite in the same way as it was in the very center of Europe, which was Vienna, which was the former glittering capital of a 15 million Habsburg Empire that was reduced to the capital of a small republic of 6 million people of post-war Austria, which emerged from the war severely impoverished, racked by a horrendous inflation. I myself am an inflation baby. I was born in 1923 before the inflation had finally really finished all its damage, which reduced the whole middle-class people of savers. They lost all their savings. And at the same time, as in Vienna at that time, it was the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 had a huge resonance. The war was extremely unpopular in Austria. A sign of how unpopular it was, this is the First World War, was the fact that Fritz Adler, who was the son of Victor Adler, who was the veneered founder of the great Austrian Social Democratic Party in the 1880s, his son Fritz Adler assassinated the chief minister. He was lionized, he was worshipped, he was celebrated for having done this in 1916, in the middle of the war. This war was hated. Socialism, revolution was in the air. I say this because it forms some of the background to the famous debate on the feasibility of a socialist economy, which took place in Vienna in the early 1920s. The first salvo was fired by a fellow called Ludwig von Mises, or Mises. And I'm sure that most of you have never heard this name before it became rather popular recently in the United States. Not only in the United States, but I read that a Mises conference, Mises Association, Canadian Mises Association is being formed or has been formed in Toronto. It's going to have chapters in every major city of Canada. So the name of this individual, which I think was virtually unknown to most of us, at least to most of you, not familiar with the history of that part of the world, has become daily currency. It is cited by Republican politicians. They have their portraits on their desk. So now Mises wrote this pamphlet to say the impossibility of a socialist economy. Why? Because you need to have market-making prices in order to have the information for the allocation of resources and so on. And a number of people challenged that from a socialist direction, including my father, whose particular ideas about how to organize an associational democratic socialism is quite interesting. I don't have time to tell you about that here, but you can read about that in I think, the third chapter of the book. But I particularly draw your attention to the second chapter, which deals with what I call, with Hayek, and as architect of the neoliberal project, of the neoliberal philosophy, of the neoliberal ideology, as distinct perhaps from the neoliberal economic program. Because interestingly, we know about the neoliberal economic policies, we know it only too well, but those policies alone, if they were not accompanied by the ideology, which was very largely, I think, the creation of Hayek and his associates starting in the 1940s, if not before, would not have the acceptance and the compliance, if you wish. It would not be hegemonic in the way, unfortunately, it appears to be, in spite of the disasters since the crisis. Don't know how this time is going. You're watching it, okay. Well, so the second and third chapters, I think in some ways are the most interesting because they play against the background of the Red Vienna of my childhood, which has been described as not only a model of urbanism, but really as a high point of the achievements of European socialism at the municipal level. For that reason, the majority of intellectuals in Vienna in the 1920s were socialists of some kind or another. They certainly were not of the mind of Mises and Hayek. So Mises and Hayek were, along with their friends, the minority. They were the outsiders in many ways in this post-war Red Vienna, which much more informally, I would love someday if at this institute we could just have a session and I could tell you memories of my childhood, memories of those May Day parades in which I, at the age of 6, 7, or 8, participated along with other children belonging to the children's organizations of gym clubs, and many other stories. But this is not the time for the stories, we don't have time. So the fourth of the essays there is based on a fascinating description called The Mechanisms of the World Economic Crisis, an article written by my father, which I have translated into English, and I am posting on my website. I have also posted on my website 3 articles having to do with the kind of socialism that he had in mind in his debates with Mises. These are not available easily in English, so I thought I would like to make them available. Of course, it can be available here at the Institute, but for ease, you can find these things on my website. The article on the mechanism of the crisis is very interesting, and that pertains to the 4th item in the book, because what he is saying there is really, look, the whole breakdown of 1929 to 33, the so-called world economic crisis, really was the final act of the breakdown of the civilization of the 19th century in 1914. There was a war. There was an attempt to resurrect the system by the victorious powers, the French, English, American, which there was punishment of the defeated countries, the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, and the whole the whole story a mess was financed by short-term capital out of New York, which when it was withdrawn in 1928, 29, everything collapsed. It is a very interesting and different interpretation of the crisis of the 30s, which preceded the Great Transformation. And then the next item is about Keynes and Polanyi. That is one that has been reprinted before. So I think I'm going to stop right there. I'm only going to say that I find it very interesting that the name of Polanyi is cited with increasing frequency in a very wide variety of different writings. I find it linked sometimes with Marx. It's Marx and Polanyi. I find it linked with Keynes and Polanyi. In my own mind, I would say Marx, Keynes, and Polanyi. I see a certain way in which all three of them are shedding a similar kind of light on the present crisis. I don't want to talk about that. I am not talking about the second part of the book, which is really addresses my own work, except that I would wish you, if you read nothing else, please do read the last chapter. The last chapter is the only thing in this book which was written now. Everything else was written sometime over the last 10 years or even less recently. But that is a contribution that I made to this book currently. And I would really very much appreciate if you could give that your appreciation. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to invite Jooneed and Kari to have a conversation about the book for about 15 minutes or so, and then we will open the floor to questions or comments, and then we can have more wine and food and buy some books.
Good evening. Bonjour. Thank you very much, Margie. Thank you so much, Kari. I've devoured your book over the last couple of days, and I can testify to the fact that it is a fantastic read. It's a great book. It's not the kind of book one expects from economists, in that it is very well written. The style is extremely flowing. It's a real page turner. And each essay stands on its own. And the essays are not too long. They are mostly adaptations from presentations you have made at different conferences. You probably polished the style while doing so, because it just reads beautifully. When you was talking about the Red Vienna of your childhood, the debates involving Mises and Hayek and your father, it's true that some of the articles were written a few years ago, and yet there is a continuity and there is a unity through the whole book, all the way to the final chapter which you wrote especially for the book, which is called, if I remember, the Decline of the West and the Rise of the Rest. There are so many questions I want to ask you, and I know time is very limited, but I think for people who don't know Karl Polanyi's work, could you, in a nutshell, how would you sum up his main, essential, basic, seminal contribution to economic thinking?
That's a hard one. First of all, But before I come to answer the question directly, he has been described variously as an economic anthropologist, an economic historian, an economic sociologist, a social philosopher, and I was delighted to find in Italy he is described as an economist. In the English-speaking world, he is not considered to be an economist, for good or for bad. So it is. How would I sum it up? I will sum it up in the sense that for the problem he addressed all his life, he tells us, is the place of the economy in society. And his main thesis would be that in no previous civilization or in no previous era of human experience has the economy taken over to shape and drive and reconstruct all aspects of society, so that the society, which is where we live within society, we are made as humans to be social creatures, become ruled by the economy. We become prisoners of the requirements of the modern capitalist economy. And the requirements of the economy, which is a social construct, but which appears to be some real thing, you know, elections, or what did Clinton say? Is the economy stupid? It's all about the economy. And we are made to believe that this thing, the economy, is some kind of autonomous mechanisms which has to be fed and pleased and tweaked and whatever, so it will continue to give us employment. So, whereas the fact is that we live in society, and the way in which we must organize our economic livelihood should be determined within society, and it has its place, but it should not rule and take over every aspect of society. I think a more popular way would be to say that this capitalist economy, as we now know it, has carried the commercialization of everything to the extreme. That is a commercialization of labor, of land, of money, where money is particularly problematic because it can actually be created by banks. We'll go into that. So he said that the economy in our system, and only in our system, has become disembedded from the social matrix and social cultural matrix in which we live. We don't live in an economy, we live in a society. And for him, the society is the base, and the economy is a social construct which is constructed by political forces and classes, whereas in the economistic view, which he condemns, whether it is economism of the right or economism of certain branches of Marxists, the economy is the basis and the society is just a superstructure. That is not true. So it's the best I can do to answer the question.
Lovely, lovely. Thank you very much. In fact, this reminds me, your answer is that his focus on the anthropological study of archaic and primitive societies was in fact to try to understand how their economies function, how those societies organize their economic life. And this led him to state this very bold idea that for the first time in human history, Ricardian England, British capitalism in the 19th century, made profit the organizing principle of economic life. And that is where the divorce occurred. But it also leads me to ask you this question, because you do relate how when you were excited by development economics, you went to him and you said, this is absolutely exciting, fascinating. You discovered these economists who were talking of development. It was the time of post-independence, post-colonial days in the 50s. And he just shrugged and said, I don't know the meaning of development. In the sense that he did not believe that what we call archaic societies were backward in that sense. I think he said that. What do you think?
Several things. First of all, he had no sense of progress or development. He did not consider that the achievements of industrial capitalism, undeniable achievements, were necessarily a progress in terms of humanity. There was no judgment in his studies of comparative societies as to whether one was better than another, and particularly not that the modern one was in some way an improvement. So that was the Victorian idea of the constant improvement of everything. And in point of fact, it is not impossible that we can destroy whatever exists on this planet. That is quite as likely as that we can make it better. So he did not like that idea of development. Secondly, I think that he really hoped that the newly independent countries of Asia and Africa, and he wrote once that my work is for the new nations of Asia and Africa, and he hoped that they would not attempt to replicate the kind of capitalism which prevailed in the West. So when he said, I don't know what that means, it was his way of saying, I'm not going there. Right? But you go ahead and you follow your interest, and of course I would do that anyway, but I also had this blessing in so doing.
Thank you. My feeling is, and I discovered Polanyi's thoughts much later than you did, and I wish I had read him earlier, because I find so much to be learned from his reflections. It is said that in a recent Davos economic forum, it was written in the media that the shadow of Polanyi is haunting, the ghost of Polanyi, yes, is haunting the Davos meeting. Which shows that obviously with the impasse which capitalism has reached and has hit rather severely, people are now discovering that beyond what Adam Smith appealed to the moral aspect of capitalism, ethics and all that Polanyi had a much more fundamental understanding of the workings and the dysfunctionalities of the capitalist system. But my sense is also that Polanyi observes, knows, analyzes, explains very convincingly, very effectively, but he does not propose a blueprint. At a time when almost everybody is trying to look for alternatives to capitalism, what kind of blueprint do you see from your father's work?
Actually, several questions there. Let me make first of all, a comment about Davos, whenever that was held. I think it was 2009 or 10.
Yes.
Yeah, if there was a ghost haunting the proceedings, that ghost has that ghost is no longer there. There was a time when there was a feeling that this crisis really was very serious and something would have to be done to reform the financial system or God knows what. But the system has survived. The banks, if anything, are stronger and more concentrated than ever. Given the disaster and given the millions of people that have suffered in the United States and not to mention in Europe, it is extraordinary that, as far as I'm concerned, the neoliberal ideology has not really been displaced from the predominance that it holds, in the sense that people can really see no way out, or that they still believe in, that somehow the good times can come back. The climate crisis is obvious, there's no question, it is undeniable, and yet nothing is being done about it. It is quite possible that there could be a financial crisis of even larger dimensions than 2008, that is all over behind the writings, and yet nothing is being done about it. So I am, the question which I ask myself is how is it that all of this is so obviously a failed system, and yet there is a reluctance, including by the public in general, to accept that fact or to face it. In other words, what is it that is the strength of this ideology? And partly it is, of course, the network of finance that is a web of finance that goes very deep into society, and in a way has virtually everybody entangled in some way, in mortgages and student loans and savings, pensions, all kinds of ways. So I am, you're asking me in which way. I think that the reason why many people have not in the past embraced Polanyi's writings is because he does not offer a simple solution. There is not any model there. And I do believe that different societies in different parts of this world are going to have to figure out their own way to assert their autonomy, to assert their self-reliance. Some of the themes, I think, are common. Some aspects, I think, are self-evident. They have to do with very basic issues of food self-reliance. They have to do with basic issues of actually attacking the consequences of climate change. I believe when you look at the situation in Europe, it is very clear that in all of the southern peripheries of Europe, the democracy is in suspense. These various regimes are only changing positions in order to carry out certain orders that are coming from the central bank and the IMF and the authorities. This is not a viable situation. I believe that one thing that my father said, which I think had a lot of wisdom in it, and that's when he was talking about these ideal measures of associational socialism in the 20s. He said we have to build on actual existing organizations of the working class at that time, of the people, of the citizens, of communities. It's not a matter of some blueprint that somebody may suggest, but it is a question of building on existing organizations of people. And that will be very different in different parts of the world. That is a very, very different. Different major regions of the world are very different. It is true that there are some common problems. And the biggest one, as far as I'm concerned, has to do with the role that is played by international capital and the dollar. In other words, countries and regions are going to have to somewhat disengage from participation in the international economy on these totally free and liberalized lines, where capital can go anywhere and do anything, and that, I think, is a common policy that will have to be addressed. I don't look to any solution coming anytime soon at the global level of negotiation, but I see it more in terms of individual regions making provision to protect their space, their social, political, and economic spaces to be arranged more according to their own needs, but rather than in terms of the free trade, the free flow of investment, dollar as universal currency. That implies different arrangements without going into detail, but I think that that is one common area, and I think the very basic issues of food security, food self-reliance. I myself would press for a reduction in the volume of international trade. There is too much stuff moving in the channels of international trade. I believe that countries have to find ways to develop economies that are turned more toward the domestic and away from the export sectors, speaking now as an economist. And the reason for that is partly that this globalization and making competition, widening the areas of competition, of course depress labor and depress wages. But it is also that businesses engage solely in export. For those businesses, wages are only a cost to be reduced. But really, let's be reasonable. Business that is engaged in the domestic economy understand perfectly well that in many ways their employees are also their customers. If not their customers, they're the customers of the guy next door. It's a different social relationship when you work within a domestic economy than from businesses that are set up there specifically and only for export. I think I'm too much of an economist now, maybe for the audience, but that's about as good as I can answer.
Thank you. I have one final question, just maybe finish covering the book, and then I'm sure there are people who have lots of questions they want to ask. The way the rise of the rest has been occurring, with the BRICS countries grouping together and increasing trade among themselves and investment, the emergence of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, ASEAN, and maybe more pointedly, it's the coming together of the new Latin America. Do you think that way that sort of regional groupings is a phenomenon that Kari Polanyi would have approved.
Absolutely, definitely. In fact, he wrote a very important paper in 1945, I think, and it was called Universal Capitalism versus Regional Economic Planning. And that is exactly what he proposed. And he said at that time he believed that only the United States believed anymore in universal global capitalism. Unfortunately, that turned out to be not quite so. But he believed at that time that it was possible to have an international system of trade and exchange which would permit regions with very different social systems, including at that time the Soviet Union, social democratic Europe, the capitalist United States, and the regions of the world to engage in trade, to coexist. And the whole idea of the coexistence of different social systems was very, very central to his thinking. In his day, it was across the Cold War divide, but today, I think we should look again at this notion, very much Polanyi's, of the coexistence of different social systems, different cultures, different religions, dominating different regions of the world, and we must find a way to live together in this world. And in that connection, many of us have suggested that we must go back to Keynes and look at his international trade union proposals, which were very imaginative, exactly designed for that kind of a world of diverse regions, rather than seeking some universal global system, which, in my father's opinion, was bound to be dominated by the strong and the powerful. And I totally agree.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jooneed.